Hi everyone, welcome back! In this video, I'll be going through 4 palettes that fell out of use and that I want to give more love and use to. I'll be cleaning the watercolors, moving them into brand new palettes, and also re-swatching the watercolors in updated swatch cards. The 4 palettes I'll be cleaning are the only gouache palette I have, the Schmincke Akademie palette, an Arteza palette, and a palette with a set of shimmer watercolors from the brand called Yasutomo. Prior to recording the video, I prepared the swatch cards for each new palette. Starting with the gouache palette, this was by far the dirtiest. As you can see, one of the paints flaked and chunks spread everywhere. Also, a lot of the magnetic strips I had attached to the bottom of the pans had already fallen off. I decided to continue using metal palettes. I've been using the ones from the brand Medine for years, so I simply chose brand new palette colors from the same brand. This brand is very affordable and you can easily find it on Amazon. In this palette, I have my first set of gouache paints by Royal and Langnickel, 5 designer gouache by Winsor & Newton in the recommended primary colors, white and black. I also have a set of 5 gouache colors by Daler Rowney, received in a scroller box, and a set of 12 pearlescent gouache paints by Arteza. Surprisingly, my favorite gouache paints are actually by Daler Rowney. Even when dried in the pans, they are surprisingly easy to reactivate and always remain super creamy. On the other hand, I have 2 colors of Winsor & Newton designer gouache that behaved really weirdly after drying. The primary yellow dried with a very grainy texture, but the graininess does disappear when the paint is properly reactivated. And the primary red cracked into a million pieces and unfortunately cannot be reactivated into the usual gouache consistency. I really wanted to like the designer gouache as Winsor & Newton is one of my favorite brands. These paints are still phenomenal, but not when reactivated from a pan. My best advice is to use them directly from the tube, which is not very convenient for me. I still don't want to give up on these paints, so I might experiment in the future with adding glycerin and guar gum to both the yellow and red to see if it improves the texture of these paints. While placing the clean pans into the new palette, I decided to actually use the metallic tray, but this did mean that I didn't have space for 1/2 pan of gouache by Royal and Langnickel. This half pan included the black, and the tube had already been used up, so I'll just keep this half pan aside and use it as a black background in my sketchbooks. I intend to keep this palette as my one and only gouache palette, with the exception of the Himi gouache, which I purchased last year. This more minimal approach is completely different to what I've been doing with watercolors, but I find that I have no desire to own more gouache colors. Watercolors are a whole different beast, as I absolutely love granulation and will never get tired of trying a brand new color. As far as gouache goes, by keeping a selection of primary colors only, I'll be able to mix virtually anything I need, and the only additions I plan on making to this palette, once I run out of the Royal and Langnickel colors, is to include the split primary options in here, from either Winsor & Newton or Daler Rowney. I also plan on transferring these paints into a Stay Wet palette in the faraway future, which will definitely help to keep the Winsor & Newton designer's gouache in their optimal consistency. But for now, this palette will stay as is. Also, the sticker I chose to use on this palette is by Denise Soden, also known on YouTube and Instagram as Liquid Ink. Next is my Schmincke Akademie palette. The stickers used in this palette are Abra and its evolutions, and I got them from Redbubble a few years ago. This palette contains the colors from the 2019 Schmincke Advent Calendar and was still in quite good condition, as I only put it together towards the end of 2023 and I haven't given it that much use. This palette mostly needed an updated swatch card, as a lot of the random colors I owned had been housed in here, and they have now been incorporated into the Franken palette I created in the beginning of this year. In this palette, there were only a few half pans that needed to be cleaned, and one half pan of green which had been contaminated with a blue watercolor from Ecoline, but I also found something incredibly surprising. The color violet went bad and completely lost all of its saturation. This is the first time I have had a watercolor go bad, and it seems that it happened within the last year or so. The Schmincke palette is a palette that I've been using more regularly nowadays, as I want to use these watercolors up. I simply not only prefer the texture of the Winsor & Newton Cotman range, but also it is more easy to find them in stores here in the UK than the Schmincke brand. With the exception of the gold that is included in this palette, I have yet to try the Schmincke Oradam range, but when it comes to the student options, I just prefer the Winsor & Newton watercolors. Apologies for the flashing light that is happening throughout this small segment of the video. I tried to fix the footage, but there was only so much I could do. Here is a comparison of the color violet swatched in 2023 and now. As you can see, there's a clear loss of saturation. As I don't have a replacement for this color, I'll just keep the half pan in this palette and I'll use it up in underlayers in paintings. Also, I forgot to mention, since the 2019 Schmincke Advent Calendar did not include the Schmincke Akademie Paints Grey color, I included a half pan of Winsor & Newton Neutral Tint instead. Next is the oldest palette of this video, containing my Arteza Premium Watercolours. This palette is in very bad condition, with a lot of rust on the metal bits that hold the pens down, and also a couple of the colors got contaminated by one of the watercolors I did out of an eyeshadow. I accidentally used way too much gum arabic on it, which means that the eyeshadow watercolor never really dried down, and when I tilted the palette and left it stored like that, it just started dripping down all over some of the other paints. As for the Arteza watercolors, I got these paints in tubes in a set of 24, roughly after I bought my first tubes of Winsor & Newton Cotman. I actually decided to buy this set because the colors I chose of Winsor & Newton Cotman watercolors made me feel overwhelmed. As a beginner, I tried my best to choose my first colors by taking the advice of several different artists, but the selection was quite strange, and honestly, I didn't know about color theory or how to mix them to get what I needed. To make things easier for me, I gave up on trying to use that weird selection of colors and decided to purchase this set of 24 watercolor tubes by Arteza, bought myself a metal palette for them, and just poured them in. Unfortunately, these two watercolors appear to not have been developed to be poured and dried into pans, because they started cracking and falling off the pans right away. To fix this, at the time, I did re-wet them overnight and mixed in a couple of drops of glycerin. Then, as they were drying down, I used a flat metal tool to press the watercolors down to avoid further cracking, and that seems to have worked fine. It did mean that the dried watercolors were extremely compact, and each half pan managed to hold more color than usual. I used this palette very consistently for about a year before I started trying out other brands, and as you can see, there's still a lot of paint left. Also, the tubes where these paints came from, they're still more than half full. Although these paints are still a little bit chalky when compared to the Winsor & Newton Cotman range, they are still very beautiful, and this palette is incredibly nostalgic for me. I learned so much about watercolors while painting with this palette. I decided to keep the Arteza half pans all together so I have space to add other watercolors in the palette in the future. Because the half pans in the center row were loose, I reused the magnetic strips from the gouache palette to hold these pans down. Lastly, for this video, I'm cleaning a palette of watercolors called Yasutomo Pearlescent Watercolours. These paints came in a different, bigger plastic palette with round wells, but they were taking too much space and I found I wasn't using them as much because of that. So I eventually re-wet them overnight and transferred each color into a half pan. These colors didn't have names, so I just named them in order of the wells in their original palette. These shimmer watercolors are extremely sheer, so I only tend to use them on top of other layers of colors. The pink palette I had them in doesn't have much wrong with it, but I had varnished the inside in hopes that this would prevent staining, but instead the varnish seems to react to some of the half pan plastics and they left some marks on the mixing areas. So I decided to swap for a new palette of the same size that I decorated with a Star Wars sticker I got from Redbubble. And that is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching all the way through the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to click the like button and subscribe for more if you haven't already. Also, since you've watched this video all the way through the end, please also leave a leaf emoji in the comments below. Not only are emojis cute, but also it helps a lot with the algorithm and for my video to reach more people. My next video is going to be an updated view on my art bag, as my last video update is from December 2023, so if that interests you, feel free to click the notification button so you are notified when that video goes live. Once again, thank you so much for watching and see you in the next video!